Welcome to True Crime Threads, where we unravel the darkest and most gripping stories. In today's video, we explore the tragic romance of a nurse and a mentally ill man that ended in unimaginable violence. The story begins in a small-town hospital where Emily, a dedicated nurse, worked long hours to care for her patients. She was known for her calm demeanor and meticulous attention to detail. Her life followed a routine, arriving early, checking on her patients, and doing what was needed to ensure everything ran smoothly. The quiet halls of the hospital were her second home, a place she found comfort in. Emily had always been driven by a strong sense of duty, so the idea of love or romance never crossed her mind. She was entirely focused on her work and rarely thought about her own personal life. But there was one patient who started to change that. Tom was a man in his early 30s who had been in and out of psychiatric care for years. He suffered from bipolar disorder and schizophrenia, a combination that made him both volatile and vulnerable. When he was calm, he could hold a conversation, but when his condition flared, he would become confused or violent. Emily had taken care of him several times before, and she had always felt a certain sadness whenever she saw him. His eyes, which once held a spark of life, now seemed distant and lost. The trauma of living with his mental illness had drained him of much of his former self. It was during one of his more stable periods that Emily noticed something different. Tom was more coherent than usual. His speech wasn't disjointed, and his eyes seemed clear for the first time in months. Emily didn't know if it was the medication working or if it was simply the natural course of his illness, but she couldn't help but notice. She found herself spending more time with him, speaking with him about things beyond his condition. She learned that Tom had once been a talented artist before his mental illness had taken hold of him. He spoke fondly of his art, telling stories of his youth when he had dreams of becoming a renowned painter. He seemed so normal then, so human. In those moments, Emily didn't see him as a patient. She saw him as a man who'd been lost to the world of illness. She saw potential, a person who deserved a second chance at life. At first, Emily believed that her growing feelings were simply a result of empathy. As a nurse, she had always been sensitive to the suffering of others, but this felt different. When she helped Tom with his daily needs, she felt a strange pull toward him, something she couldn't explain. It wasn't love, not yet, but there was an undeniable connection. Tom's sadness mirrored her own in some ways, and she found herself drawn to him in a way she had never been with any other patient. Though she tried to push the feelings aside, she couldn't ignore the way her heart would race when she saw him. Emily told herself that it was just a professional bond, but deep down she wondered if there could be something more between them. She began thinking about him outside of work hours, replaying their conversations in her mind. She would catch herself imagining what it would be like if Tom's life were different, if his illness didn't define him. She told herself that it wasn't right, that she was crossing a line, but she couldn't seem to stop herself from thinking about him. One evening, after a particularly long shift, Emily went to check on Tom, who had been feeling unusually calm. The hospital room was dimly lit, and the only sounds were the soft hum of the machines that monitored his health. Tom, usually restless and disoriented, sat quietly by the window, staring out into the night. He didn't seem to be agitated, which was rare for him. His eyes were focused, and there was a certain peace about him that Emily had not seen before. She entered the room quietly, not wanting to disturb the tranquility he had found, but when he saw her, he smiled. A warm, genuine smile that seemed to light up his face in a way she hadn't seen in years. Emily noticed a change in him, a shift from the troubled, unpredictable patient she knew to someone who seemed more present, more aware of the world around him. For the first time in a long while, she felt a sense of ease in his presence. As she checked his vitals and made sure he was comfortable, Their conversation drifted naturally from his condition to lighter topics. They spoke about simple things, what he had been doing before his hospitalization, his love for painting, his memories of better days before the illness overtook him. There was something in his voice that made Emily feel connected to him, something familiar yet profound. As he spoke, he opened up about his past, the man he once was before mental illness had consumed him. He was articulate and thoughtful, not the person Emily had come to know through his hospital visits. They continued talking for hours, and Emily found herself hanging on every word. His stories felt real, filled with hopes and dreams that were no longer accessible to him due to his condition. She felt deeply moved by the way he described his life before the illness, and she could see the person he might have been, someone full of promise and ambition. It was as if, for a brief moment, the fog of his mental illness lifted, and the true Tom was revealed to her. Before leaving for the night, Emily found herself lingering in the room longer than she had planned. She had become so absorbed in the conversation that she hadn't noticed how much time had passed. As she stood to say goodbye, she hesitated for a moment. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand on his. It was a simple gesture, one that she had made countless times with patience, but this time it felt different. It wasn't professional anymore. It was personal. Tom looked at her in surprise, his expression softening as their eyes met. For a fleeting moment, Emily felt a rush of emotions, a warmth that made her heart race. She quickly withdrew her hand, feeling a mix of confusion and guilt. She had crossed a line, one she had promised herself she would never cross. But in that moment, she couldn't deny that something had shifted between them. The connection was undeniable. Tom was more than just a patient to her now. There was a tenderness in the way they had interacted, a spark that neither of them could ignore. She left the room that night, feeling both conflicted and oddly elated, unsure of what the future held, but knowing she couldn't easily turn away from what had just transpired. The next day, Tom was discharged from the hospital. Emily felt a pang of loss as she said her goodbyes, knowing that this might be the last time she saw him as a patient, but a part of her couldn't help but wonder if she would see him again, if their paths would cross outside the sterile walls of the hospital. Despite the professional boundaries she had always maintained, Emily felt a pull, a desire to continue their connection. She told herself that she had to let go, that her role as his nurse was over, but deep inside, she couldn't shake the feeling that something more was unfolding. As their relationship grew more intense, Emily found herself grappling with the reality of loving someone with a severe mental illness. Tom's mood swings, once something she could manage in the hospital setting, were becoming harder to predict. On some days, he was the sweet, sensitive man she had started to care for, open and engaging. On others, he became angry and paranoid, convinced that everyone around him was conspiring against him. Emily tried her best to maintain a sense of control, but each encounter left her more emotionally drained than the last. Their time together became increasingly erratic. One moment they would share a quiet dinner, enjoying each other's company, laughing at the little things. But the next, Tom's mood would shift without warning, and he would retreat into a cloud of suspicion, staring at Emily as though she were a stranger. He would accuse her of lying, of betraying him, even though she had done nothing wrong. These moments were terrifying for Emily, who had never encountered such a dramatic change in a person's behavior. She found herself walking on eggshells, unsure of what would set him off next. Despite the instability, Emily couldn't walk away. She believed, perhaps naively, that love could heal him. Every time Tom would lash out, she tried to remain calm and patient, telling herself that it was just a phase, that he needed time to adjust. She took on the responsibility of helping him, of being his anchor. She would remind him to take his medication, encourage him to attend therapy, and do everything she could to make sure he felt supported. But despite her best efforts, There were moments when she questioned whether she was helping or enabling his decline. Her friends and colleagues had started to notice the changes in her. They could see the emotional toll the relationship was taking on her. They urged her to end things before it got worse, warning her that it wasn't healthy to continue with someone so unpredictable. Emily heard their concerns but dismissed them. She couldn't help but feel that Tom was misunderstood, that his mental illness didn't define who he truly was. She saw the man beneath the illness, the artist, the dreamer, and she couldn't let go of the idea that he still had the potential for greatness. She believed that if she just stayed by his side, he could overcome his struggles. But the more she ignored her own feelings and continued to put all her energy into their relationship, the more she lost herself. She became isolated from her friends, choosing to spend all her time with Tom. Her professional life began to suffer as she couldn't focus on her patients the way she once had. Emily's sense of self started to fade as she poured all her attention into trying to fix Tom. She felt trapped, caught in a cycle of love, guilt, and frustration. There were moments when she wondered if she was even in control anymore, if the relationship was becoming something far more destructive than she had imagined. Still, Emily couldn't bring herself to leave him. She believed that love was enough, that with time things would improve. But the emotional weight of their relationship was becoming unbearable, and Emily knew deep down that she couldn't keep going like this forever. The uncertainty of each day, the constant fear that Tom might snap at any moment, was starting to wear on her. She had to confront the truth. She couldn't save him, but for now she remained by his side, hoping for a miracle that would never come. One night, things took a tragic turn. Tom's behavior had been more unpredictable than usual, and Emily had begun to sense that something was off. His moods, once erratic, were now on a knife's edge. One moment he was calm and affectionate, the next his eyes were wide with paranoia, and he seemed distant, lost in his own thoughts. He had stopped taking his medication, convinced it was making him worse. Emily tried to encourage him to take it, but Tom insisted that he could manage without it, that the medicine was part of a conspiracy to keep him subdued. Despite her attempts to reason with him, Emily began to realize that nothing she said could calm him down. His thoughts seemed to spiral further into confusion. She had seen the warning signs before, when his illness had caused him to lash out at staff in the hospital, but this felt different. His anger was more intense, more unpredictable. He was no longer the man she had once known, the man she had fallen for. There was only a shell of that person left, buried under layers of fear and delusion. That night, Emily went to his apartment, worried about his well-being. She found him pacing in the living room, his face pale and drawn. He barely acknowledged her at first, lost in his own world, murmuring to himself. Emily sat down, trying to get him to focus on her, to reassure him that everything was okay. But Tom's paranoia had reached a boiling point. He became convinced that Emily had been plotting against him, that she was trying to leave him. His eyes were wild and his voice grew louder, shaking with emotion as he accused her of betraying him. Emily tried to speak calmly, but she could see that he wasn't listening anymore. Suddenly, in one swift motion, Tom grabbed a kitchen knife from the counter. Emily froze, her heart racing as she tried to make sense of what was happening. His hands trembled as he held the knife in front of him, the blade reflecting the dim light of the room. Tom's voice became a harsh whisper, as though speaking to someone else in the room. He accused Emily of plotting against him, of being part of a scheme to hurt him. There was no recognition in his eyes, no sign that he knew the person standing before him. In that moment, Emily's training as a nurse kicked in. She knew she had to stay calm to try and de-escalate the situation, but it was impossible. Tom's grip on the knife tightened and his paranoia intensified. Emily backed away, slowly, trying to keep her distance, trying to find a way out. She spoke to him gently, urging him to put the knife down, to listen to her, but her words fell on deaf ears. Without warning, Tom lunged forward, and Emily barely managed to step aside, narrowly avoiding the blade. The shock and fear coursing through her body made it hard to think clearly. Her heart pounded as she struggled to breathe, realizing how close she had come to serious harm. The man she had tried so hard to help, to love, was no longer the person she had known. He was consumed by his illness, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. Emily managed to run to the door, her hands shaking as she turned the handle. She looked back one last time at Tom, who was standing in the middle of the room, staring at her, the knife still in his hand. The guilt and confusion in his eyes were unmistakable. But it didn't matter. Emily fled the apartment that night, terrified and heartbroken, unsure of what to do next. The emotional toll of the attack, the realization that she had put herself in this dangerous situation, was too much to bear. The woman who had believed she could help him, who had put her faith in love, was left to confront the brutal truth. She couldn't save him, and now she wasn't sure if she could save herself either. The news of the attack spread quickly through the small town. The once peaceful community was now shaken by the events that had unfolded. Tom was arrested and sent back to a psychiatric facility, where he would face charges for the assault on Emily. It was a devastating turn for everyone involved, and the shock waves of the incident rippled through the hospital where Emily had once worked. The staff was left to process the fallout from what had happened, and many were left questioning the ethical boundaries that had been crossed. Emily, however, was the one who had to deal with the aftermath most intensely. She couldn't escape the memories of that night. The images of Tom with the knife, his face twisted by fear and anger, haunted her. Despite everything that had happened, she still felt an overwhelming sense of guilt. She couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, there was something more she could have done. Could she have prevented it? Could she have reached him in a way that would have stopped his descent into violence? The questions plagued her mind every waking moment. Unable to bear the constant reminders of her past, Emily made the decision to leave the town and the life she had known. She quit her job at the hospital and moved to a different city, hoping to escape the ghosts of her former life. It wasn't just the memories of Tom that she was running from, but the shame she felt about her involvement in the tragedy. She couldn't continue working in healthcare after everything that had happened. It felt as though her very identity had been torn apart. The idealistic nurse who believed she could heal and save people was now someone who had been profoundly hurt. Her sense of purpose had vanished, leaving her adrift. In the new city, Emily tried to rebuild her life, to piece together the fragments of her broken self. She found a job in a completely different field, hoping that a fresh start would give her the perspective she needed to move forward. But the scars of her past ran deep, and she struggled to find any sense of peace. She often found herself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, replaying the events over and over. Despite her best efforts to distance herself from her former life, she could never fully escape the memories of Tom, the love she had tried to nurture, and the violent end it had come to. Years passed, and Emily tried to push the memory of Tom to the back of her mind. She built a new life, found new friends, and even started to heal in some ways. But there were moments, fleeting but powerful, when she would think about him. She would wonder what had become of him, whether he was getting the help he needed, if he was still alive, or if he had ever fully understood the pain he had caused. But these thoughts would always fade, replaced by the harsh reality that nothing would ever be the same. Tom, now in a secure psychiatric ward, was left alone with his own guilt. He had moments of clarity where he recognized the gravity of what he had done. The man he had been, the artist with dreams and potential, had been swallowed by the illness that had ravaged his mind. In those moments he was tormented by the knowledge that he had hurt the one person who had cared for him, the one person who had tried to help him when no one else would. But it was too late. The damage had been done, and there was no way to undo the past. The tragedy of their relationship, of Emily's love and Tom's illness, was something neither of them could escape. It was a painful reminder that sometimes, no matter how hard you try, love alone isn't enough to heal the deepest wounds. The small town that had witnessed their story was left to mourn the potential of what might have been. But for Emily, the real tragedy lay in the loss of herself. Her belief in the power of love and her ability to help those in need had been shattered in the most devastating way possible.